The wagon wheel creaked once, then stopped. Rowan Hale dropped the fence post he'd been setting and stared at the dust cloud settling near his property line. No one came out here. Not anymore. He walked closer, boots crunching through August heat, and saw her, pale skin, torn dress, wrists carved red from rope. A woman, delivered like livestock. The note pinned to her chest read only 2 words: paid, delivered. Then he saw the brand burned into the wagon's side, a serpent coiled around an iron fist. Gideon Voss. The name alone made his blood run cold. Before we continue, if you're watching from anywhere in the world, drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Hit that like button and stay with me until the end, because what happens next will leave you speechless. The sun had no mercy that morning. It hung over the Arizona desert like a forge door left open, baking the scrub brush and turning the air into something you could chew. Rowan Hale had been awake since before dawn, mending the fence line that separated his ranch from the emptiness beyond. 48 years old, shoulders broad from decades of hard labor, face weathered into permanent creases. He was a man built by this land and broken by it in equal measure. He didn't talk much anymore. Didn't have reason to. The ranch hands he'd once employed were long gone. His wife Sarah had been dead 11 years. Their daughter Emma, 10. Fever had taken them both within a week of each other, and Rowan had spent every day since keeping the world at arm's length. So when he heard the faint groan of wagon wheels drifting through the heat shimmer, he froze. No one came out here. The nearest town, Tombstone, was 8 miles south. His property sat at the ragged edge of civilization, where the law grew thin and men made their own rules. Visitors meant trouble. Always had. Rowan set down his tools and walked toward the sound, hand instinctively brushing the grip of the revolver on his hip. The wagon came into view slowly, pulled by a single exhausted horse that looked ready to collapse. The driver's bench was empty, the reins dragged in the dirt. "Whoa," Rowan called softly, catching the horse by its bridle. The animal shuddered, foam flecking its mouth. It had been driven hard. The wagon bed was covered with a stained canvas tarp. Rowan's gut tightened. He'd seen enough death in his life to recognize its smell. He pulled back the canvas carefully, half expecting to find a corpse. Instead, he found something worse. A woman lay curled on her side, wrists bound with coarse rope that had cut deep enough to draw blood. Her dress was torn at the shoulder, caked with dust and sweat. Dark hair stuck to her face in matted strands. She wasn't moving. "Jesus," Rowan breathed. He climbed into the wagon, pressing 2 fingers to her neck. A pulse, faint, but there. Relief flooded through him, immediately followed by a colder emotion, dread. Because pinned to her chest was a folded piece of paper. Rowan pulled it free, unfolding it with trembling hands. The handwriting was crude, scratched out in heavy ink. Paid, delivered. That was all. No name, no explanation, just 2 words that turned his stomach inside out. Then he saw the brand. Burned into the wagon's side panel, about the size of a man's hand, was a symbol Rowan had hoped never to see again, a serpent coiled around an iron fist, its fangs bared. The mark of Gideon Voss. "No," Rowan whispered. "No, no, no." His hands moved on instinct. He cut the ropes binding the woman's wrists with his pocket knife, careful not to jostle her too much. She groaned softly, eyelids fluttering but not opening. He lifted her as gently as he could, she weighed almost nothing, and carried her toward the house. The ranch house was modest, built from sun-bleached wood and stubbornness. Inside it was sparse. A kitchen table, a wood stove, a single bedroom that Rowan rarely used anymore. He mostly slept in the chair by the fireplace. He laid the woman on his bed, fetching water and clean rags. As he cleaned the cuts on her wrists, her eyes finally opened. They were gray, sharp, and filled with something that looked like hatred. "You paid for me," she said hoarsely. "So just do it." Rowan jerked back like he'd been slapped. "What? No, I didn't." "Don't lie," her voice cracked. "I saw the note. I know what I am." "Ma'am, I swear to you, I had nothing to do with this." Rowan held up his hands, showing her he meant no harm. "I found you in that wagon not 20 minutes ago. Someone left you on my property." She stared at him, searching his face for deception. Slowly, painfully, she pushed herself upright. The room swayed around her, but she didn't flinch. Where am I? About 8 miles north of Tombstone. This is my ranch. Who are you? Rowan Hale. The name seemed to mean nothing to her. She looked down at her wrists, at the raw wound still bleeding sluggishly. They said someone paid. They said I was being delivered to a buyer. Rowan's jaw tightened. What's your name? She hesitated. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. Mara. Mara Vale. Mara. Rowan nodded slowly. I don't know who sent you here, but I didn't order this. I didn't buy you. You're not property. Then why am I here? That was the question that had been clawing at Rowan's mind since he'd seen the brand. Gideon Voss didn't make mistakes. If one of his wagons had ended up on Rowan's land, it was deliberate. But why? I don't know, Rowan admitted, but we're going to find out. Mara refused to stay in bed. Despite her injuries, despite the exhaustion that made her hands shake, she insisted on sitting at the kitchen table while Rowan made coffee. She watched him with the wary intensity of a cornered animal, ready to bolt at the first sign of danger. How long were you in that wagon? Rowan asked, setting a tin cup in front of her. I don't know. Days, maybe. They kept me drugged. She wrapped her hands around the cup, though she didn't drink. I remember being in a cellar, then a room with bars, then the wagon. Where were you before that? Kansas City. Her voice was flat, drained of emotion. I worked in a dress shop. One night I was walking home and someone grabbed me from behind. Next thing I knew, I woke up in chains. Rowan felt something dark and familiar rising in his chest, the same rage that had driven him to violence once before, years ago. He forced it down. How many others were with you? 6 when I was taken, but they separated us. I don't know where the others went. She finally met his eyes. Are you going to turn me in? Turn you in? Rowan frowned. For what? For being stolen property. That's what the law sees, isn't it? Someone paid for me. That makes me a transaction. Not here. Rowan's voice was hard as iron. Not on my land. Mara studied him for a long moment. Why do you care? It was a fair question. Rowan looked away, staring out the window at the empty desert beyond. Because a long time ago, I didn't care enough, and people died because of it. Before Mara could respond, the sound of hoofbeats echoed from outside. Rowan was on his feet instantly, hand on his revolver. Stay here. Who is it? Don't know. But if it's who I think it is, things are about to get complicated. He stepped out onto the porch, squinting against the glare. 2 riders were approaching, one on a bay mare, the other on a black gelding. As they drew closer, Rowan recognized the first man, Luther Kane, the supply clerk from Tombstone's general store. The second was a stranger, thin and weasel-faced, with the kind of smile that made Rowan's trigger finger itch. Rowan, Luther called out, waving cheerfully. Got your delivery. What delivery? Rowan kept his voice level, but his hand stayed near his gun. Luther dismounted, pulling a folded invoice from his saddlebag. Your order from last week, flour, salt, coffee, and... He glanced at the paper, frowning. Huh. And 1 special item, paid in advance. I didn't order any special item. Well, someone did. Luther handed him the invoice. See? Right there. Signed and paid for. Rowan scanned the document. His stomach dropped. At the bottom, in handwriting he didn't recognize, was a line item. 1 unit, female. Domestic use, $500. And below it, a signature, R. Hale. That's not my signature, Rowan said quietly. Luther's smile faltered. What? I said that's not my signature. Rowan shoved the paper back at him. Someone forged it. The weasel-faced man finally spoke, his voice oily and smooth. Now, Mr. Hale. Let's not make this difficult. The order was placed, the payment was made. All that's left is to collect the merchandise. There's no merchandise here. Oh, I think there is. The man's eyes flicked toward the house. We know she's inside. We can do this the easy way or the hard way. Rowan's revolver was in his hand before the man finished speaking. Get off my property. Luther stepped back, hands raised. Rowan, come on. I said get off my property. The weasel-faced man didn't move. Instead, he smiled wider. Mr. Voss anticipated you might be, uncooperative. He wanted me to deliver a message. At the mention of Voss's name, Rowan felt ice slide down his spine. He says to tell you that old debts have a way of coming due, and that he's a patient man but not a forgiving one. Tell Voss, Rowan said slowly, that if he wants a war, he'll get one. The man tipped his hat mockingly. I'll pass along your regards. He and Luther mounted their horses and rode off, leaving a cloud of dust in their wake. Rowan stood on the porch, guns still drawn, until they disappeared from sight. When he turned back to the house, Mara was standing in the doorway. Who's Voss? She asked. Rowan holstered his gun. Someone I thought I'd left in the past. He's the one who brought me here, isn't he? The one who owns that brand. Rowan nodded grimly. Gideon Voss runs a network, moves people like cargo across the frontier, sells them to whoever's buying. I crossed him once, a long time ago. Thought he'd forgotten. What did you do? Rowan was silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and haunted. I freed someone he'd claimed as property. A young man named Samuel, barely 16. Voss had sold him to a mine owner up in Colorado, but the boy escaped and made it to my ranch. I hid him, helped him get to California. Voss never forgave me for it. Did Samuel make it? I don't know. I never heard from him again. Rowan met her eyes. But Voss made sure I paid. He burned my barn, poisoned half my livestock, and spread word that I was a thief. Nearly lost everything. Mara's expression hardened. So this is revenge. He sent me here to frame you. Looks that way. What happens now? Rowan exhaled slowly. Now we figure out how to keep you alive. Because if Voss thinks you're his property, he'll come to collect, and he won't care who gets hurt in the process. That night, Rowan didn't sleep. He sat in the kitchen, cleaning his rifle by lamplight while Mara rested fitfully in the next room. Every sound, the creak of settling wood, the whisper of wind through the eaves, made his hand drift toward his gun. He'd known men like Voss before. Men who saw other human beings as inventory, as tools to be used and discarded. The frontier was full of them, hiding behind the thin veneer of civilization, operating in the shadows where the law's reach grew weak. But Rowan had also learned something over the years. Daylight was the best disinfectant. If he could drag this into the open, force people to see what Voss really was, maybe, just maybe, he could turn the trap around. Around midnight, Mara emerged from the bedroom, wrapped in one of Sarah's old shawls. She looked steadier now, though her eyes still carried that haunted edge. Can't sleep? Rowan asked. Every time I close my eyes, I'm back in that cellar. She sat down across from him. How do you live with it? With what? The fear. The knowledge that someone out there wants to hurt you. Rowan set down the rifle. You learn to make the fear useful. Let it sharpen your senses, keep you alert, but you don't let it control you. Is that what you did after you lost your family? The question hit harder than Rowan expected. He looked away, jaw tight. No. After they died, I let the fear hollow me out. I stopped living, just existed, kept the ranch running because I didn't know what else to do. What changed? Nothing. Rowan met her eyes. Until today. They sat in silence for a while, the lamplight casting long shadows across the rough-hewn walls. Finally, Mara spoke again. You said you'd figure out how to keep me alive. Do you have a plan? The start of one. Rowan leaned forward, elbows on the table. Voss is smart. He knows the law out here is flexible, especially when money's involved. If he claims you're his property, that you were stolen from him, he can get a warrant, legally seize you. So what do? We take away his legal claim. Mara frowned. How? Rowan took a breath. What he was about to propose was insane, reckless, and possibly the only thing that would work. We get married. Mara stared at him like he'd lost his mind. What? A frontier marriage certificate. It's a legal document that establishes you as my wife, not as property. If you're legally married, Voss can't claim ownership. The law recognizes marriage before it recognizes a bill of sale. That's... Mara trailed off, shaking her head. That's crazy. It's the only thing I can think of that might work. And if it doesn't? Then we're no worse off than we are now. Mara was silent for a long time, her fingers tracing the grain of the wooden table. When she finally looked up, her expression was unreadable. Would it be real, the marriage? Only on paper, only as long as you need it. Rowan's voice was steady. I'm not asking you to be my wife, Mara. I'm asking you to let me stand between you and the men who want to take you back. Another long silence. Then quietly, okay. Okay? Yes. Mara's voice was stronger now. Let's do it. Toot. The next morning, Rowan hitched up his own wagon and helped Mara into the seat beside him. She'd cleaned up as best she could, wearing one of Sarah's old dresses that Rowan had dug out of a trunk. It was too big in some places, too small in others, but it was better than the torn rags she'd arrived in. The ride to Tombstone took most of the morning. Mara didn't speak much, her gaze fixed on the horizon as if she expected danger to come galloping out of the heat shimmer at any moment. Rowan couldn't blame her. Tombstone was exactly what its name suggested, a dying town clinging to the edge of survival. Once a booming silver mining hub, it had withered over the years as the ore ran out and the miners moved on. Now it was a collection of false front buildings and dusty streets, populated by the stubborn, the desperate, and the dangerous. Rowan guided the wagon down Allen Street, past the Oriental Saloon and the Birdcage Theater, until he reached a modest building with a faded sign, Justice of the Peace, C. Whitmore. This is it, Rowan said, setting the brake. Mara stared at the building like it might bite her. Are you sure about this? No. Rowan climbed down, then offered her his hand. But we're doing it anyway. Inside, the office was cramped and smelled of old paper and tobacco smoke. Behind a cluttered desk sat a heavy-set man with spectacles perched on the end of his nose. He looked up as they entered, blinking in mild surprise. Rowan Hale, the man said, rising to his feet. Been a while. Clarence, Rowan nodded. Need a favor. What kind of favor? The marrying kind. Clarence's eyebrows shot up. He looked from Rowan to Mara, then back again. Well, I'll be damned. Didn't think I'd see the day. It's complicated. Isn't it always? Clarence shuffled through a stack of papers, pulling out a blank marriage certificate. Names? Rowan Hale and Mara Vale. Clarence filled in the information with slow, deliberate strokes of his pen. You got witnesses? No. Well, that's a problem. Need at least one witness to make it legal. I'll find someone. Rowan turned toward the door and froze. Standing on the boardwalk outside, watching through the window, was the weasel-faced man from the day before. And he wasn't alone. Two rough-looking men flanked him, hands resting on their gun belts. Rowan? Mara's voice was tight with fear. Stay here. Rowan stepped outside, letting the door swing shut behind him. The weasel-faced man smiled. Mr. Hale, fancy meeting you here. What do you want? Just checking in on Mr. Voss's property, making sure she's being well cared for. She's not his property. See, that's where you're wrong. The man pulled a folded document from his coat. Got a bill of sale right here, signed by Mr. Voss himself. Says he purchased one Mara Vale from a broker in Kansas City. Legal and binding. Rowan's blood ran cold. You're lying. Am I? The man unfolded the document, holding it up. Says here she was bought and paid for 3 weeks ago, which means she belongs to Mr. Voss, and anyone harboring stolen property. He let the threat hang in the air. I'm not harboring anyone. She's here of her own free will. That's not what the law will say. Rowan's hand drifted toward his gun, but before he could draw, one of the other men stepped forward, a rifle leveled at his chest. Easy now, the weasel-faced man said softly. No need for violence. Just hand over the girl, and we'll be on our way. No. Mr. Hale, I really must insist. The door behind Rowan swung open. Mara stepped out onto the boardwalk, her chin raised defiantly. I'm not going anywhere with you. The weasel-faced man's smile widened. Ah, there she is, Miss Vale. I'm afraid you don't have a choice in the matter. Actually, Clarence said, emerging from the office with the marriage certificate in hand, she does. The weasel-faced man's smile faltered. What? This here's a legal marriage certificate, properly signed and witnessed. Clarence held up the document. Which means Miss Vale is now Mrs. Hale. And according to territorial law, a married woman can't be claimed as property by anyone other than her husband. The weasel-faced man's face went red. That's a fraud. Is it? Because it looks legal to me. Clarence adjusted his spectacles. You can take it up with a judge if you like, but until then, Mrs. Hale stays with her husband. For a moment, Rowan thought the man might draw his gun anyway, but then, slowly, he folded the bill of sale and tucked it back into his coat. Mr. Voss isn't going to like this, he said quietly. Tell Voss, Rowan replied, that I'm done running from him. The three men exchanged glances, then turned and walked away, their boots echoing on the wooden planks. Rowan didn't relax until they were out of sight. Then he turned to Clarence. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. Clarence handed him the certificate. That piece of paper might buy you some time, but it won't stop Voss. He'll find another way. I know. Mara took Rowan's arm, her fingers trembling slightly. What do we do now? Rowan looked down at the marriage certificate, at the names written in Clarence's careful script. Rowan Hale and Mara Vale. Two strangers bound by necessity, standing against a darkness that had no intention of letting them go. The ride back to the ranch felt longer than it should have. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat. Every distant dust cloud might conceal riders. Mara sat rigid beside Rowan, the marriage certificate folded in her lap like a talisman that might ward off the darkness closing in around them. How long do you think we have? She asked, breaking the silence that had stretched between them since leaving Tombstone. Rowan kept his eyes on the road ahead. Not long. Voss will regroup, come at us from a different angle. Men like him don't accept defeat, they just change tactics. You're not what I expected. He glanced at her. What did you expect? I don't know. Mara's fingers traced the edge of the certificate. When I woke up in that wagon, when I saw the note, I thought I knew what kind of man would buy another person. But you're not that. I've done things I'm not proud of, Rowan said quietly. Made choices that still keep me up at night. But buying people? That's a line I won't cross. Why did you really help me? You could have just sent me away, claimed you never saw me. Would have been safer for you. Rowan was silent for a long moment, the wagon creaking beneath them as they rolled over uneven ground. My daughter was 10 when she died, Emma. She had your eyes, that same gray color, like storm clouds. He swallowed hard. After she was gone, I kept thinking about all the things I should have done differently, all the ways I failed her. When I found you in that wagon, I saw a chance to not fail someone again. Maybe that's selfish. Maybe I'm just trying to make up for things that can't be fixed, but I couldn't turn away. Mara's hand found his on the reins, squeezing gently. It's not selfish. It's human. They didn't speak again until the ranch came into view, but something was wrong. Rowan felt it before he saw it, a wrongness in the air, a tension that made the hairs on his neck stand up. What is it? Mara asked, sensing his unease. I don't know. Rowan slowed the wagon, studying the property. Everything looked normal. The house, the barn, the fence line stretching into the distance, but his instincts were screaming that something had changed. Then he saw it. Tied to his porch railing was a horse he didn't recognize, a fine animal, too fine for these parts. And standing in the shadow of the house, leaning against the doorframe like he owned the place, was a man Rowan had hoped never to see again. Gideon Voss. He was tall, lean as a whip, dressed in a black suit that looked absurdly formal against the dusty backdrop of the ranch. His face was angular, handsome in a predatory way, with eyes the color of cold steel. A silver watch chain glinted at his vest, and his boots were polished to a mirror shine. "Rowan Hale," Voss called out, his voice smooth as oil. "Been a long time." Rowan brought the wagon to a stop 20 feet from the house. His hand moved toward his gun, but Voss raised a finger, tisking softly. Now, no need for unpleasantness. I'm here to talk, not fight." He pushed away from the doorframe, descending the porch steps with the casual confidence of a man who knew he held all the cards. "Though I must say, I'm impressed. Marriage certificate, very clever. Didn't think you had it in you. Get off my property, Voss." "Your property?" Voss smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. See, that's where things get interesting, because according to the land office, you're 3 months behind on your taxes, which means this property is about to go up for auction, and I happen to know someone very interested in purchasing it. Rowan's blood turned to ice. You're lying. Am I? Voss pulled a document from his coat. He seemed to carry an endless supply of damning papers and held it up. Tax lien, filed 2 weeks ago. You've got until the end of the month to pay up, or the bank takes everything. It couldn't be true. Rowan had been struggling, yes, but he'd kept up with the taxes. He'd made the payment himself, back in June, handed the money to the county clerk, unless someone had made it disappear. You did this, Rowan said, his voice flat with rage. You bought off the clerk, made it look like I never paid. Now why would I do something like that? Voss's smile widened. But let's say hypothetically that the records got confused. Mistakes happen, after all. The good news is I'm a reasonable man. I'm prepared to make you an offer. I'm not interested. You haven't heard it yet. Voss's gaze shifted to Mara, and something predatory flickered in his expression. You return my property, the merchandise that was delivered to you in error, and I make your tax problem go away. Simple, clean, everyone walks away happy. She's not your property, Rowan said through gritted teeth. She's my wife. A marriage of convenience, performed under duress. Any judge worth his salt would see through it. Voss took a step closer to the wagon. Miss Vale, you seem like an intelligent woman. Surely you understand the position you're in. Mr. Hale is a drowning man. Attaching yourself to him will only drag you under with him. Mara's voice was steady when she spoke. I'd rather drown than go with you. Something dark flashed across Voss's face, there and gone in an instant. When he smiled again, it was colder. Brave words. Let's see how brave you feel when this ranch is burning around you. Rowan's gun was in his hand before he consciously decided to draw it. Get off my land. Voss held up his hands in mock surrender, still smiling that terrible smile. I'm going. But I'll be back, and next time, I won't be alone. He mounted his horse with fluid grace, settling into the saddle like a king on a throne. You've got 3 days to reconsider my offer, Rowan. After that, all bets are off. He wheeled the horse around and rode off. Not hurried, not worried. A man who knew time was on his side. Rowan didn't lower his gun until Voss disappeared over the rise. Then his arm dropped, the weapon suddenly feeling impossibly heavy. Is it true? Mara asked quietly. About the taxes? I don't know. Rowan climbed down from the wagon, his legs unsteady. But I'm going to find out. Inside the house, he dug through the wooden box where he kept his important papers. Bills of sale, property deeds, receipts. Everything was there except the tax receipt. He'd had it. He knew he'd had it. But now it was gone. He must have sent someone to take it, Rowan said, more to himself than to Mara. While we were in town. That's why he was here, to make sure we knew he could get to us any time he wanted. Mara stood in the doorway, arms wrapped around herself. What do we do? We fight. Rowan straightened, jaw set. But we can't do it from here. If Voss can manipulate the records in Tombstone, he can manipulate them anywhere in this county. We need to go higher up the chain. How much higher? Tucson, territorial court. If we can get in front of a judge who isn't in Voss's pocket, we might have a chance. And if we can't? Rowan met her eyes. Then we run, as far and as fast as we can. But even as he said it, he knew running wouldn't work. Voss had resources, connections that stretched across the frontier. He could reach them anywhere. The only way out was through. That night, Rowan didn't pretend to sleep. He sat on the porch, rifle across his knees, watching the darkness for movement. Mara joined him after midnight, wrapped in a blanket against the desert chill. You should rest, Rowan said. So should you. Can't. If they come tonight, they won't. Mara settled into the chair beside him. Voss wants you afraid, wants you making mistakes. He'll wait, let the pressure build. That's how men like him work. You sound like you've dealt with his type before. Everyone has, in one form or another. The details change, but the pattern's always the same. They find your weakness, exploit it, break you down piece by piece until you're too tired to fight back. She pulled the blanket tighter. That's why you can't let him see you're afraid. I am afraid. I know, so am I, but we can't let him know that. They sat in silence, watching the stars wheel overhead. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, the sound lonely and wild. Tell me about your family, Mara said softly. Your wife and daughter. Rowan was quiet for so long she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then, slowly, the words came. Sarah was a school teacher when I met her, smartest woman I ever knew. Could quote Shakespeare and fix a broken wagon wheel in the same afternoon. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Emma was just like her, curious about everything. Always asking questions, always wanting to understand how the world worked. She used to follow me around the ranch, helping with the animals, getting in the way, in the best possible way. How did it happen? Fever. Came on sudden one August, swept through Tombstone like wildfire. Sarah got sick first, then Emma. I rode to town for the doctor, but by the time we got back... He stopped, swallowing hard. Sarah died that night. Emma held on for 3 more days, long enough for me to tell her all the things I should have said sooner. Then she was gone too. Mara's hand found his in the darkness. I'm sorry. Me too. Rowan squeezed her fingers. For a long time after, I thought about joining them. Eating a bullet seemed easier than waking up every morning in an empty house. But I couldn't do it. Couldn't let their deaths be for nothing. So I kept going, kept the ranch running, kept breathing. Until eventually breathing didn't hurt quite so much. Do you think they'd approve of what you're doing now? Rowan considered the question. Sarah would have helped you herself. Probably would have shot Voss's man the second he showed up. Emma would have wanted to keep you, ask you 1,000 questions about Kansas City. His voice softened. Yeah, I think they'd approve. The next morning came too fast. Rowan was hitching the wagon before dawn, loading supplies for the trip to Tucson. It was a 3-day ride under the best circumstances, longer if they had to avoid trouble. And trouble was almost certainly waiting. Mara helped him pack, moving with the efficiency of someone who'd learned to travel light. She wore men's clothing now, trousers and a shirt Rowan had found in an old trunk, along with boots that were only slightly too big. Her hair was tied back, and in the gray pre-dawn light, she looked like a completely different person from the broken woman he'd found in the wagon. We should bring the collector, she said suddenly. Rowan paused, a water skin half loaded. What? The man who came to collect me. The one you tied up. Mara's eyes were sharp, calculating. He's proof. Physical evidence that Voss sent someone to retrieve what he claims is his property. If we bring him to the court, he can testify. You think he'll talk? I think he'll talk to save his own skin. Men like that always do. Rowan had almost forgotten about the collector. After tying him up the first night, he'd locked the man in the barn, bringing him water and food but otherwise leaving him alone. It wasn't mercy, it was practicality. A witness could be useful. They found the collector right where Rowan had left him, wrists bound to a support beam, looking significantly worse for wear. He'd spent 2 days in the barn's heat, and it showed. His face was sunburned, his lips cracked, his expensive clothes stained with sweat and dirt. Water, he croaked when they entered. Please, Rowan handed him a canteen. The man drank greedily, water spilling down his chin. You're coming with us, Rowan said. Where? Tucson. You're going to tell a judge exactly what Voss is running, who he sells to, where the people come from, how the operation works. The collector's eyes widened with fear. I can't. He'll kill me. Maybe. But if you don't talk, I'll make sure you hang for kidnapping and human trafficking. Your choice. The man's face went pale. You can't prove anything. Can't I? Rowan held up the note that had been pinned to Mara's chest. This is your handwriting, isn't it? And I've got witnesses who saw you show up at my ranch demanding to collect merchandise. That's enough to get you charged. Whether you hang or just spend the rest of your life in territorial prison, well, that depends on how cooperative you are. The collector's resistance crumbled. Okay, I'll talk. Just don't let Voss find out until I'm safely in protective custody. Deal. They hauled the collector into the wagon bed, leaving his hands bound. Rowan wasn't taking chances. As the sun crept over the horizon, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson, they set out for Tucson. The first day passed without incident. They kept to the main road, avoiding the shortcuts that would take them through remote country where ambushes could happen unseen. Rowan drove while Mara kept watch, a rifle resting across her lap. The collector sat in the back, silent and sullen. By evening, they'd covered maybe 25 miles. Not as far as Rowan would have liked, but better than nothing. They made camp in a rocky outcropping that offered some protection, building a small fire to ward off the desert cold. "Tell me about the operation," Rowan said to the collector as they ate. "How does Voss move people without getting caught?" The collector stared into the fire, his face haggard. "He's got connections everywhere. Law enforcement, politicians, businessmen. Half the people in power out here are on his payroll in one way or another." "That doesn't answer my question. He uses legitimate businesses as fronts, supply companies, freight services, even some of the stage lines. People get loaded onto wagons like cargo, hidden under tarps or in false bottom crates. By the time anyone notices, they're hundreds of miles from where they started." "Where do they come from?" Mara asked, her voice tight. "Everywhere. Cities back east mostly. Voss has recruiters who look for opportunities. People no one will miss. Orphans, drifters, immigrants who don't speak English." The collector's voice dropped. "Sometimes they're taken by force, like you. Sometimes they're tricked, promised jobs or passage west. Either way, once Voss has them, they disappear into the system." "How many?" Rowan asked. "I don't know. Dozens? Hundreds? I only handled deliveries in this region." Mara's knuckles were white where she gripped her rifle. "Who buys them?" "Anyone with money and no conscience. Mine owners who need workers they don't have to pay. Brothel operators. Ranchers looking for labor they can control absolutely. There's always a market." Rowan felt sick. He'd known Voss was bad, but this was something else entirely. An entire industry built on human suffering, operating in the shadows of civilization. "Tomorrow," he said quietly, "you're going to write all of this down. Every name you know, every location, every detail, and you're going to sign it. And if I don't, then I'll leave you here for the vultures." The collector believed him. Smart man. They took turns keeping watch that night. When Rowan woke Mara for her shift, he found her staring at the collector with an expression he couldn't quite read. "You all right?" he asked. "I keep thinking about the others, the women who were with me when I was taken. They're still out there, still trapped in whatever hell Voss sold them into." Her jaw tightened. "If we stop him, does that help them? Or is it too late?" "I don't know," Rowan admitted. "But if we don't stop him, there will be more. More women stolen, more lives destroyed. That has to count for something." Mara nodded slowly. "Get some sleep. I'll wake you if anything moves." But Rowan couldn't sleep. He lay on his bedroll staring up at the stars, thinking about Sarah and Emma, about all the people Voss had destroyed, about the thin line between civilization and chaos. Out here, that line was barely visible. It took so little to cross it: a drought, a bad harvest, a man with enough money and no morals. The question was whether the law could still hold when tested, whether justice meant anything when power could be bought and sold like everything else. He was still thinking about it when Mara's urgent whisper cut through the darkness. "Rowan, we've got company." But he was on his feet instantly, gun in hand. In the distance, maybe half a mile out, he could see lights, torches, moving toward them in a loose line. "How many?" Rowan asked. "I count 6, maybe more behind them." The collector scrambled to his knees, eyes wide with terror. "It's them! It's Voss's men!" "How did they find us?" Mara demanded. "I don't know. Maybe they've been following since Tombstone, waiting for the right moment. Doesn't matter how." Rowan was already moving, dousing the fire, gathering their gear. "We need to move. Now." They broke camp in minutes, loading everything onto the wagon with frantic efficiency. But the lights were getting closer, and Rowan knew they couldn't outrun riders in a loaded wagon. "There's a box canyon about 2 miles north," he said. "Narrow entrance, high walls. If we can get there, we might be able to defend it." "Or get trapped," Mara countered. "It's a risk." But staying here is certain death. They ran. The wagon bounced and jolted over rough terrain, wheels screaming in protest. Rowan pushed the horses hard, harder than he should have, but there was no choice. Behind them, the torches spread out, trying to flank them. Mara fired twice, aiming high, just trying to slow them down. The shots echoed across the desert like thunder. There! Rowan pointed ahead to where the canyon mouth opened like a wound in the earth. Hold on! They plunged into darkness, the canyon walls rising on either side, blocking out the stars. Rowan didn't slow down until they were 100 yards in, where the canyon widened slightly into a natural bowl. Out! Out of the wagon! He dragged the collector free while Mara grabbed the rifles and ammunition. Take positions on either side. Don't fire until I give the word. They scrambled up the rocky walls, finding cover behind boulders. Rowan positioned himself on the left, Mara on the right, the collector cowering behind a fallen rock at the canyon's center. Then they waited. The riders appeared at the canyon mouth moments later, torches held high. Rowan counted 7 men, all armed. They paused at the entrance, smart enough not to charge blindly into a potential ambush. "Rowan Hale!" The voice echoed off the canyon walls, not the weasel-faced man from before. Someone new. Deeper voice, more authority. "You've got something that belongs to Mr. Voss. Send it out, and we'll let you live." "No deal," Rowan shouted back. "Turn around and ride out while you still can." Laughter rippled through the group. "You're outnumbered and outgunned. There's no way out of this canyon except through us. So let's make this easy." Rowan glanced across at Mara. Even in the darkness, he could see the determination in her eyes. She wasn't backing down. Neither was he. "Last chance," the voice called. Rowan's answer was to cock his rifle. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then one of the riders spurred his horse forward, and hell broke loose. Gunfire erupted, muzzle flashes lighting up the canyon like lightning. Rowan fired, levered another round, fired again. Beside him, Mara's rifle cracked steadily, each shot deliberate and controlled. The first rider went down, his horse screaming and rearing. A second took a bullet to the shoulder and fell. But the others kept coming, spreading out, using their torches to try and spot the defenders. "They're flanking left," Mara shouted. Rowan swung his rifle around, catching one of the riders in his sights. The man dropped his torch, clutching his leg. But there were too many. They were going to be overwhelmed. Then, from the darkness beyond the canyon mouth, came new gunfire. Not aimed at Rowan and Mara, aimed at Voss's men. The riders scattered in confusion, torches dropping as they tried to identify this new threat. Rowan didn't waste the opportunity. He picked off another rider, then another, and suddenly it was over. The remaining riders fled, galloping back the way they'd come, leaving their wounded behind. Silence fell like a hammer. "Who the hell was that?" Mara breathed. Rowan didn't know. But as a lone rider approached the canyon entrance, hands raised to show he was unarmed, recognition sparked. It was Clarence Whitmore, the Justice of the Peace from Tombstone. And behind him, riding in a loose group, were maybe a dozen other men, shopkeepers, ranchers, people Rowan recognized from town. "Figured you might need some help," Clarence called out. "Voss has been getting too bold for too long. Time someone stood up to him." Rowan climbed down from his position, legs shaking with adrenaline. "You followed us?" "Followed Voss's men. They weren't exactly subtle about gathering a posse." Clarence dismounted, his face grim in the torchlight. "Word's spreading, Rowan. People are starting to wake up to what's happening, but you need to get to Tucson. Get this in front of a judge before Voss can bury it." "We're going." Rowan glanced at the wounded men on the ground. "What about them?" "We'll handle it. Get moving before Voss sends reinforcements." Mara had already climbed back into the wagon. Rowan joined her, the collector still huddled in the back, and they rode out of the canyon at a gallop. Behind them, Clarence and his men were gathering Voss's wounded, binding their hands, taking their weapons. It wasn't much, but it was something. A crack in Voss's armor, small but real. And sometimes, Rowan thought as the wagon wheels ate up the miles toward Tucson, a crack was all you needed to bring down a wall. Dawn found them 20 miles closer to Tucson, the horses lathered and exhausted. Rowan finally allowed himself to slow the pace, letting the animals recover while he and Mara scanned the horizon for pursuit. The desert stretched endlessly in all directions, painted in shades of amber and rust by the rising sun. We can't keep running like this, Mara said, her voice hoarse from dust and fatigue. The horses won't make it. I know. Rowan's hands ached from gripping the reins all night. There's a way station about 5 miles ahead. We can rest there, change horses if they've got any available. The collector stirred in the wagon bed, groaning. He looked even worse than before. Face gray with exhaustion, clothes torn from scrambling over rocks during the firefight. How much farther to Tucson? 2 days, maybe less if we push hard. Rowan didn't look back at him. You'd better hope we make it, because if Voss catches us out here, your testimony won't matter. None of us will live long enough to reach a courtroom. You think I don't know that? The collector's voice cracked. I've seen what he does to people who betray him. There was a man in Yuma who tried to go to the law. They found him hanging from a bridge with his tongue cut out. Mara's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. The way station appeared like a mirage out of the heat shimmer, a squat adobe building with an attached corral and water tank. Smoke rose from the chimney, which meant someone was home. Rowan approached cautiously, one hand on his gun, but the station keeper who emerged was just an old man with rheumy eyes and a limp. Help you folks? He asked, squinting at them. Need to rest our horses, maybe trade for fresh ones if you've got them. The old man studied the exhausted animals, then nodded. Got 2 in the corral. Not much to look at, but they'll get you where you're going. Cost you, though. How much? $20 each. It was robbery, but Rowan didn't have time to negotiate. He counted out the money from his dwindling supply of cash and watched as the old man brought out 2 horses that looked only marginally better than the ones they were replacing. While the station keeper helped with the transfer, Mara pulled Rowan aside. We're running out of money. I know. And even if we make it to Tucson, what then? Court proceedings cost money. Lawyers cost money. We're bleeding resources we don't have. Rowan had been thinking the same thing. The marriage certificate had bought them time, but time without resources was just a slower death. We'll figure it out, one problem at a time. That's not a plan. No, Rowan admitted, but it's all we've got. Inside the way station, they bought coffee and stale bread, overpriced like everything else, and sat at a rough wooden table while the collector remained tied up outside. The old man watched them with undisguised curiosity but didn't ask questions. Out here, people minded their own business. It was healthier that way. I've been thinking, Mara said quietly, warming her hands on the tin coffee cup, about what happens after. Even if we win in court, even if Voss goes down, his network doesn't just disappear. There are others like him. The demand doesn't stop just because one supplier gets arrested. So what are you saying? I'm saying this is bigger than us, bigger than one court case. She met his eyes. And I'm wondering if we're enough to make a real difference, or if we're just putting a bandage on a gunshot wound. Rowan understood the feeling. He'd spent years wondering if anything he did mattered, if Sarah and Emma's deaths had meant something, or if the world just kept grinding forward, indifferent to individual tragedy. Maybe we're not enough. Maybe this whole thing falls apart and Voss walks free. But the alternative is doing nothing. And I'm done with doing nothing. Mara studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. All right, then we see it through. They were back on the road within the hour, pushing southeast toward Tucson. The new horses were marginally better, though one had a tendency to pull left that made Rowan's shoulders ache from correcting. The collector had finally stopped complaining and sat in sullen silence, occasionally muttering to himself. Tell me something, Mara said as the miles rolled past. When this is over, if we survive, what do you want? What do I want? Yes, beyond stopping Voss, beyond the immediate crisis. What does your life look like on the other side of this? Rowan hadn't let himself think that far ahead. Survival had consumed every thought, every action, but now, forced to consider it, he found the answer came easier than expected. Peace. Just peace. A quiet life where I don't wake up expecting the worst. That's all? That's everything. He glanced at her. What about you? I don't know yet. Mara's fingers traced patterns on her knee. A month ago I had a life, small, predictable, safe. I worked in a dress shop, saved money for a better room, dreamed about maybe opening my own business someday. Then it all got ripped away, and now I don't know who I am anymore. The woman who wanted those things feels like a stranger. Trauma does that, changes you into someone you don't recognize. Is that what happened to you after your family died? Yeah. Rowan's voice was rough. I became someone who could survive losing everything, but survival isn't the same as living. It took me a long time to understand that. They fell silent again, but it was a different kind of silence now. Not uncomfortable, but companionable. Two people who'd been forced together by circumstance, finding something unexpected in each other. The afternoon heat became oppressive, shimmering waves distorting the horizon. Rowan was considering stopping for a brief rest when he spotted movement ahead. Riders, 4 of them, approaching from the direction of Tucson. "Company," he said tersely, reaching for his rifle. Mara already had hers in hand. "Friends or trouble?" "Out here? Assume trouble until proven otherwise." But as the riders drew closer, Rowan saw they weren't Voss's men. These were official, deputy badges gleaming on their chests, carbines holstered but ready. The lead rider raised a hand in what might have been greeting or warning. "That's far enough," the deputy called out when they were within speaking distance. He was young, maybe 30, with a thick mustache and hard eyes. "State your business." "Headed to Tucson," Rowan replied carefully. "Got business with the territorial court." "That's so." The deputy's gaze swept over them, lingering on the bound collector in the wagon bed. "What kind of business requires traveling with a prisoner?" "The kind where we've got evidence of a criminal enterprise operating across 3 territories: human trafficking, document fraud, bribery of public officials." Rowan kept his voice steady. "We're bringing a witness to testify." The deputies exchanged glances. The leader leaned forward in his saddle, eyes narrowing. "You got a name?" "Rowan Hale." Recognition flickered across the deputy's face, followed by something that looked like calculation. "Hale? Yeah, I've heard of you. You're wanted for questioning in connection with kidnapping and theft of property." Rowan's blood turned to ice. "That's a lie. We're the victims here, not the criminals." "Maybe so, but I've got a telegram from Tombstone says different." The deputy pulled a folded paper from his coat. "Says you forcibly abducted a woman named Mara Vale and are preventing her lawful return to her legal owner." "I'm right here," Mara said sharply. "And I'm telling you there's no legal owner. I'm not property. I was kidnapped and trafficked, and Mr. Hale rescued me." "That true?" The deputy looked genuinely uncertain now. "Every word." Rowan pulled out the marriage certificate. "She's my wife, legally married 3 days ago in Tombstone. Justice of the Peace Clarence Whitmore performed the ceremony. The witness in our wagon can confirm that Gideon Voss orchestrated the whole scheme to frame me." At the mention of Voss's name, something shifted in the deputy's demeanor. The leader's jaw tightened, and one of the others muttered something under his breath. "Voss?" the deputy repeated slowly. "Gideon Voss? You know him?" "Everyone knows him, or knows of him anyway." The deputy's expression had gone carefully neutral, which told Rowan everything he needed to know. Either these men were on Voss's payroll, or they were afraid of him. Maybe both. "Look," Rowan said, choosing his words carefully, "we're not asking you to take our word for it. We're headed to Tucson to present evidence to a judge. Let us pass. Let the court decide who's telling the truth." "Can't do that. Got orders to bring you in if we found you." "Orders from who?" The deputy didn't answer, which was answer enough. Mara's rifle shifted slightly, not quite pointing at anyone but ready. "So what now? You arrest us, drag us back to Tombstone, hand us over to Voss? How much did he pay you?" "Watch your mouth, lady." "Or what? You'll shoot me? That'll look real good in the official report." Her voice dripped with contempt. "Territorial deputies gunned down kidnapping victim trying to reach safety. I'm sure the newspapers in Tucson would love that story." The deputy's face reddened. "Nobody's shooting anyone, but you're coming with us." "No." Rowan's hand moved toward his gun. "We're not." For a breathless moment, it could have gone either way. 4 armed deputies against 2 civilians and a bound witness. The math wasn't good. But Rowan had one advantage. These men were uncertain. They'd been given orders, but those orders conflicted with what their eyes and ears were telling them. Then the collector did something unexpected. He stood up in the wagon bed, hands still bound, and spoke in a voice that carried across the desert air. "My name is Calvin Reed. For the past 2 years, I've worked as a collector for Gideon Voss, transporting people he's purchased through illegal trafficking operations. I've delivered men, women, and children to buyers in 6 territories. And I can prove every word because I kept records." The deputies stared at him. "I kept records," Calvin repeated, his voice stronger now. "Names, dates, locations, payments, everything. And if you arrest these people, if you prevent them from reaching Tucson, you become part of the conspiracy, accessories to human trafficking, which, according to territorial law, carries the same penalty as the primary offense." "You're bluffing," the deputy said, but his conviction was wavering. "Am I? Take us back to Tombstone and I'll make sure every newspaper from here to San Francisco knows that territorial deputies aided and abetted a criminal enterprise. Your names, your faces, your careers, all done. Or you can let us pass, let the court sort this out, and maybe come out the other side with your reputations intact." The silence stretched taut as a bowstring. Finally, the deputy cursed under his breath and reined his horse to the side. "Get out of here. But if this testimony of yours doesn't hold up, if you're lying, we'll hunt you down personally. Understood?" "Understood," Rowan said. They rode past the deputies, every muscle tensed for the gunshot that never came. It wasn't until they were half a mile down the road that Mara finally exhaled. "That was either very brave or very stupid," she said to Calvin. "Probably both." He sagged against the wagon side. "But if I'm going to hang anyway, might as well make it count for something." They made camp that night in a dry wash, using the embankment as cover. No fire. Too risky. They ate jerky and drank warm water from their canteens while the temperature dropped and stars emerged overhead like ice chips scattered across black velvet. "How long have you been keeping records?" Rowan asked Calvin. "Since the beginning. Started as insurance in case Voss ever tried to throw me to the wolves. Figured if I had proof of his operation, he'd think twice about getting rid of me." Calvin laughed bitterly. "Guess that didn't work out how I planned." "Where are these records now?" "Hidden. Safe place in Tucson with someone who doesn't know what they're holding. If anything happens to me, they're supposed to open the package and deliver it to the territorial marshal." "That's why Voss wants you back," Mara said. "Not just to silence you, but to find those records." "Probably, though I'd die before telling him where they are." Calvin met her eyes. "I've done terrible things, Miss Vale. Helped destroy lives, torn families apart. Can't take that back. But maybe I can stop it from happening to others. Maybe that's worth something." "Maybe," Mara said quietly. They took turns on watch again. When it was Rowan's shift, he found himself thinking about Calvin's words, about redemption, and whether it was possible to balance scales so badly tipped. He'd spent years believing his own failures were unforgivable, that losing Sarah and Emma had marked him as someone who couldn't be trusted with anything precious. But maybe that wasn't true. Maybe the question wasn't whether you'd failed, but what you did after the failure, whether you gave up or kept fighting. He was still thinking about it when Mara came to relieve him at midnight. "Can't sleep?" she asked, settling beside him. "Thinking too much." "About what?" "About whether any of this matters. Whether stopping Voss actually changes anything, or if there's just another monster waiting to take his place." Mara was quiet for a moment. "My mother used to say that you can't fix the whole world, but you can fix your corner of it, and if everyone fixed their corner, the whole world would get better." Wise woman. "She was." Mara's voice softened with old grief. "Died when I was 16, cholera. After that, it was just me. No other family? None that wanted anything to do with a poor orphan girl. I learned pretty quick that the world doesn't care much about people who can't help themselves. That's why what you're doing, what we're doing, matters. Because someone has to care. Someone has to stand up and say, this isn't right. This isn't acceptable." Rowan reached out, taking her hand. She didn't pull away. "When this is over," he said slowly, "that marriage certificate, it doesn't have to be just paper. If you wanted it to mean something real, I wouldn't object." Mara turned to look at him, her face unreadable in the starlight. "Are you proposing to me, Rowan Hale?" "I guess I am, though it's probably the worst proposal in history, given our circumstances." "It's not the worst I've heard." A small smile touched her lips. Ask me again when we're not running for our lives, when there's time to think about futures instead of just surviving the present. Fair enough? They sat together in comfortable silence, hands linked, watching the stars wheel slowly across the sky. For the first time since finding Mara in that wagon, Rowan felt something that wasn't fear or anger. Hope, maybe. Fragile and uncertain, but real. The next day brought them within sight of Tucson. The territorial capital sprawled across the valley like an ambitious promise, buildings of adobe and wood stretching toward the mountains beyond. It was bigger than Tombstone, more permanent, with actual streets and a plaza and the solid stone courthouse that represented their best chance at justice. Almost there, Mara breathed, but Rowan's attention was caught by something else. Riders, coming hard from the north. Too many to be coincidence, moving with clear purpose. We've got trouble, he said. Mara saw them too. Voss? Who else? Rowan snapped the reins, pushing the tired horses into a gallop. Hold on! The wagon careened down the slope toward town, wheels bouncing over rocks and ruts. Behind them, the riders closed the distance, their shouts carrying across the desert air. Stop! Stop in the name of the law! They're claiming to be lawmen! Mara shouted over the thunder of hooves. Doesn't matter! We stop now! We're dead! They hit the outskirts of Tucson at full speed, startled pedestrians diving out of the way. People shouted, pointed, confused by the chaos suddenly erupting in their streets. The courthouse loomed ahead, solid and official and tantalizingly close. But their pursuers were faster. 3 riders cut them off, forcing Rowan to haul on the reins. The wagon skidded to a stop in the middle of the plaza, surrounded by a growing crowd of onlookers. The lead rider dismounted, and Rowan's heart sank. It was the weasel-faced man from Tombstone, flanked by men wearing deputy badges that looked freshly minted. "Rowan Hale!" the man called out, his voice carrying across the plaza. "You're under arrest for kidnapping, theft, and obstruction of justice." "That's a lie." Rowan stayed in the wagon, hands visible, knowing that any sudden movement could turn this into a bloodbath. "We're here to testify before the territorial court about human trafficking operations run by Gideon Voss." At the mention of Voss's name, a ripple went through the crowd. People knew that name, feared it. "Mr. Voss is a respected businessman," the weasel-faced man said smoothly, "and you're a criminal attempting to slander his good name. Now step down from that wagon before this gets unpleasant." "I'm not going anywhere until I speak to a judge." "You'll speak to whoever I tell you to speak to." The standoff held, tension crackling through the air. The crowd had grown larger, drawn by the spectacle. Shopkeepers, merchants, housewives, laborers, all watching to see how this would play out. Then Calvin stood up in the wagon bed, hands still bound, and did the bravest and stupidest thing Rowan had ever seen. He started talking, loud enough for everyone to hear. "My name is Calvin Reed. For 2 years, I worked for Gideon Voss, trafficking human beings across 3 territories. I have proof. Records of every transaction, every buyer, every victim. And these men," he gestured at the weasel-faced man and his companions, "are here to silence me before I can testify." "Shut your mouth." The weasel-faced man's hand went to his gun. "I have names," Calvin shouted, desperation and defiance mixing in his voice. "Names of everyone involved, politicians, lawmen, businessmen, the entire network. And if you kill me here in front of all these witnesses, those names become public. My associate in this city has instructions to release everything if I don't check in." "You're bluffing. Try me." The crowd was murmuring now, uncertainty spreading like ripples in water. The weasel-faced man looked around, seeming to realize for the first time how exposed he was. This wasn't some remote desert road where violence could be hidden. This was the territorial capital, in broad daylight, with hundreds of witnesses. "Stand down." The new voice came from the courthouse steps. A man in a black suit stood there, flanked by 2 actual territorial marshals. He was older, maybe 60, with steel gray hair and the bearing of someone used to authority. "I'm Judge Harrison Blackwood. Someone want to explain what in blazes is happening in my plaza?" Rowan seized the moment. "Your Honor, my name is Rowan Hale. We're here to present evidence of a criminal conspiracy involving human trafficking, document fraud, and corruption of public officials. We have a witness willing to testify, and we request protective custody while the investigation proceeds. Judge Blackwood's eyes swept over the scene, the wagon, the bound witness, Mara with her rifle, the men with their fake badges. And these gentlemen? Private contractors working for Gideon Voss, attempting to prevent us from reaching your court. That true? The judge asked the weasel-faced man. Absolutely not. This man is a known criminal. Then you have proper arrest warrants? Official documents? The weasel-faced man hesitated. The paperwork is being processed. So that's a no. Judge Blackwood descended the courthouse steps, his expression carved from granite. In that case, you gentlemen can either leave peacefully or my marshals can escort you to a cell while we sort this out. Your choice. The weasel-faced man's jaw worked, fury and calculation warring in his expression. Finally, through gritted teeth, he said, "We're leaving, but this isn't over." "I expect it isn't," the judge said mildly, "but it'll continue in my courtroom, under proper legal procedures, not in my plaza with guns drawn." The men mounted their horses and rode off, but slowly, making sure everyone saw they weren't really retreating, just choosing a different battlefield. Judge Blackwood turned back to Rowan. "You three, inside, now. And someone better start explaining things in a way that makes sense, because I have very little patience for nonsense." They climbed down from the wagon, legs shaky with relief and residual fear. As they followed the judge toward the courthouse, Mara leaned close to Rowan. "We made it," she whispered. "We made it," he confirmed. The courthouse interior was cool and dim after the glare of the plaza. Judge Blackwood led them through a narrow corridor lined with law books and dusty files, past clerks who looked up with undisguised curiosity, into a private chamber that smelled of tobacco and old leather. The judge gestured for them to sit, then positioned himself behind a massive oak desk that had probably witnessed 1,000 desperate pleas. "Start talking," he said without preamble, "and make it coherent." Rowan glanced at Mara, then at Calvin, trying to decide where to begin. Finally, he pulled out the marriage certificate and the note that had been pinned to Mara's chest, placing both on the judge's desk. 10 days ago, I found this woman abandoned on my property in a wagon marked with Gideon Voss's brand. She'd been kidnapped in Kansas City, transported across 3 territories, and delivered to me like freight. This note was attached to her. Judge Blackwood examined the documents, his expression unreadable. "And the marriage certificate. We obtained it as legal protection. Voss claimed ownership of Miss Vale through a fraudulent bill of sale. By marrying her, I established her as a free woman under territorial law, not property that could be seized. Clever, risky, but clever." The judge's eyes shifted to Mara. "This was your choice, ma'am? The marriage?" "It was," Mara said firmly. "Mr. Hale offered it as protection, nothing more. I accepted because the alternative was being dragged back into captivity. And you, Mr. Reed," Judge Blackwood studied Calvin with the intensity of a man who'd spent decades separating truth from lies. "What's your role in all this?" Calvin's hands trembled despite being unbound now. One of the marshals had cut the ropes when they entered the courthouse. "I worked for Voss. 2 years as a collector and transporter. I moved people across territories, delivered them to buyers, handled the logistics of the operation." "Why come forward now?" "Because I'm tired of being a monster." Calvin's voice cracked. "Because I've seen things that wake me up screaming, and I can't carry it anymore. And because Voss was going to kill me anyway once he realized I'd kept records." The judge leaned forward. "What kind of records?" "Everything. Names, dates, locations, payments. Every transaction I was part of, documented and stored safely. If the court grants me immunity, I'll provide access to all of it." "That's a significant claim, Mr. Reed. Evidence of that magnitude could bring down half the power structure in this territory." "I know." Judge Blackwood sat back, steepling his fingers. For a long moment, the only sound was the ticking of a clock on the wall. Finally, he spoke. "I'm going to be frank with you. Gideon Voss is connected to some very powerful people. Challenging him means challenging them. There will be pressure, political, financial, possibly violent, to make this go away. Are you prepared for that?" "We don't have a choice," Rowan said. "If we back down now, Voss wins. More people get hurt. The system that allows this continues. Noble sentiment, but nobility doesn't stop bullets. The judge pulled a sheet of paper toward him, dipping a pen in ink. Still, I took an oath to uphold the law, and the law says human trafficking is a crime regardless of who's committing it. So here's what's going to happen. I'm placing all three of you under court protection. You'll be housed in secure quarters, guarded by marshals I personally trust. Tomorrow morning, we convene a preliminary hearing to examine the evidence. If it's as substantial as Mr. Reed claims, we move to a full investigation and trial. What about Voss? Mara asked. I'll issue a summons requiring him to appear and answer questions. Whether he actually shows up, Judge Blackwood shrugged. Men like him have ways of avoiding inconvenient legal obligations, but we'll follow proper procedure. Procedure won't stop him from coming after us, Rowan said. No, but it puts his actions under a microscope. Every move he makes now is documented, witnessed, subject to scrutiny. That's worth something. The judge stood, signaling the meeting was over. Marshal Davies will take you to your quarters. Stay there, don't go wandering, and try not to get yourselves killed before tomorrow. I'd hate to waste all this paperwork. The quarters turned out to be a converted storage room in the courthouse basement, furnished with 3 narrow beds and a chamber pot. Not luxurious, but secure. One door, no windows, a marshal stationed outside. Prison and sanctuary in equal measure. Mara tested one of the beds, grimacing at its hardness. I've slept in worse. Me too, Calvin said quietly. He'd been subdued since entering the courthouse, the reality of his situation finally sinking in. Do you think the judge believed us? He believed enough to not hand us over, Rowan said. That's something. But will it be enough? Mara stood pacing the small space. Voss has had years to build his network, buy his protection. We have one night to prepare a case that could unravel all of it. The odds aren't exactly in our favor. They never were. Rowan sat on another bed, exhaustion finally catching up with him. His body ached from days of riding, fighting, running. But we're still alive, and we made it to court. That's further than I thought we'd get. A knock at the door interrupted them. Marshal Davies entered, carrying a tray of food, bread, cheese, cold meat, and a pitcher of water. Not much, but better than jerky and warm canteen water. Compliments of the judge, Davies said, setting the tray down. He was younger than the other marshal, maybe 35, with watchful eyes and a scar running down his left cheek. Eat, rest. You'll need your strength tomorrow. Thank you, Mara said. Davies paused at the door. For what it's worth, I hope you folks are telling the truth. Been hearing rumors about Voss for years, but nothing anyone could prove. If you can bring him down... He didn't finish the thought, just nodded and left, locking the door behind him. They ate in silence, too tired for conversation. But as night fell and oil lamps were lit in the corridor outside, Calvin finally spoke. I need to tell you where the records are, in case something happens to me. Nothing's going to happen, Mara said, but without conviction. You don't know that. Voss has reach, even in places that should be safe. If I don't make it to tomorrow, someone needs to know. He looked at Rowan. There's a boarding house on 3rd Street, Mrs. Chen's place. In room 7, there's a loose floorboard under the bed. The records are in a metal box beneath it. Why Mrs. Chen? She's the only person in this city I trust. Her daughter was taken 5 years ago, sold to a brothel in California. Never seen again. Mrs. Chen knows what Voss is, even if she can't prove it. She's been waiting for someone to bring him down. Rowan committed the information to memory. If it comes to that, I'll make sure the records reach the judge. Thank you. Calvin lay back on his bed, staring at the ceiling. I keep thinking about all the people I helped destroy. Mothers separated from children, families torn apart, lives ruined so men like Voss could make money. And I told myself it wasn't my fault, that I was just following orders, just doing a job. But that's a lie. I knew. I always knew. You can't change the past, Mara said quietly, but you're trying to make the future better. That counts for something. Does it? Does trying to do good erase the evil you've done? No, but it's still worth doing. Calvin closed his eyes, and Rowan saw tears tracking down his face. The man was broken, guilt-ridden, terrified. But he was also the key to everything. If his testimony held up, if his records were as comprehensive as he claimed, they might actually have a chance. Might being the critical word. Rowan lay on his own bed, listening to the sounds of the courthouse settling around them. Footsteps overhead, distant voices, the creak of wood adjusting to temperature changes. Normal sounds, but everyone made him tense, hand drifting toward the gun the marshals had reluctantly allowed him to keep. "Can't sleep?" Mara whispered from the darkness. "Too wired." "Me too." He heard her shift on her bed. "Keep thinking about tomorrow. About standing in that courtroom facing down whatever Voss throws at us." "Scared?" "Terrified. You?" "Same." Rowan rolled onto his side, trying to see her in the dim light filtering under the door. "But also, I don't know. Hopeful, maybe. For the first time in years, I feel like I'm doing something that matters, like Sarah and Emma would be proud." "They would be," Mara said with certainty. What we're doing, takes courage. Not the loud kind, but the quiet kind. The kind that says, I'm going to stand up even though I'm afraid, even though I might lose." "When did you get so wise?" "Somewhere between Kansas City and here. Trauma either breaks you or teaches you. I decided I'd rather learn." They fell silent again, but Rowan felt comforted by her presence. Two damaged people finding strength in each other. It wasn't romance, not yet. They barely knew each other beyond crisis and necessity. But it was connection, and that was enough. Sometime in the small hours, he finally slept, and dreamed of a courtroom where truth actually mattered, where justice wasn't just a word painted on a wall, but something real and solid you could hold in your hands. Morning came with brutal efficiency. Marshal Davies woke them at dawn, bringing more food and fresh water. "Hearing starts in 2 hours. Judge wants you presentable." They cleaned up as best they could with a basin of water and rough soap. Mara used what was left of the marshal's supplies to make herself look less like a fugitive and more like a respectable woman testifying in court. Calvin shaved with a borrowed razor, his hands shaking so badly Rowan had to help. "Steady," Rowan said. "Just tell the truth. That's all you have to do." "What if the truth isn't enough?" "Then we improvise." At 8 o'clock, they were escorted upstairs to the courtroom. It was larger than Rowan expected, with high ceilings and tall windows that let in streams of morning light. Wooden benches filled with observers, townspeople, journalists, the curious, and the concerned. At the front, Judge Blackwood sat behind an elevated bench, looking even more imposing than he had yesterday. And on the opposite side of the room, flanked by 3 lawyers in expensive suits, sat Gideon Voss. He looked exactly as Rowan remembered, elegant, composed, utterly confident. When his eyes met Rowan's, he smiled slightly. Not threatened, not worried, just amused by this inconvenient interruption to his business. "All rise," the clerk called out. "Territorial Court is now in session, the Honorable Judge Harrison Blackwood presiding." The formalities washed over Rowan in a blur. Judge Blackwood explaining the purpose of the hearing, the lawyers introducing themselves. Voss's chief counsel, a silver-haired man named Aldrich, objecting to the proceedings on multiple grounds before they even started. "Your Honor," Aldrich said smoothly, "my client is a respected businessman who's been falsely accused by a known criminal and his accomplices. This entire hearing is based on hearsay and the desperate fabrications of people trying to avoid legal consequences for their own actions." "Mr. Aldrich," Judge Blackwood said dryly, "you'll have ample opportunity to present that argument, but first, let's hear what the accusers have to say. Mr. Hale, you may proceed." Rowan stood, acutely aware of every eye in the courtroom watching him. He'd never been good with public speaking, had spent most of his life avoiding situations that required it. But this wasn't about comfort. This was about survival. "Your Honor, 10 days ago, I discovered a young woman who'd been delivered to my property like cargo. She'd been kidnapped, transported across territories, and was intended for sale. The wagon she arrived in bore the mark of Gideon Voss's operation." He pulled out the note, holding it up. This was pinned to her chest. 2 words, paid, delivered. "Objection," Aldrich said immediately. "There's no evidence connecting that note to my client." "The wagon itself carried Mr. Voss's brand," Rowan countered. "A serpent coiled around a fist. That's not speculation, that's fact. A brand that could have been placed there by anyone wishing to implicate my client." Judge Blackwood raised a hand. "Mr. Aldrich, I said you'd have your chance. Let the man finish. Continue, Mr. Hale." Rowan described everything: the forced marriage certificate, the confrontations with Voss's collectors, the attempt on their lives in the desert, the fake deputies trying to arrest them before they could reach Tucson. With each detail, he watched Aldrich's expression, looking for cracks in that professional facade. He found none. When Rowan finished, Judge Blackwood turned to Mara. "Mrs. Hale, I'd like to hear your account." Mara stood, her voice steady despite the trembling Rowan could see in her hands. "I was taken from Kansas City 3 weeks ago, grabbed off the street at night, drugged, transported in wagons and railroad cars with false documentation. I was held with 5 other women, all of us destined for different buyers. When I woke up on Mr. Hale's property, I believed he'd purchased me. That's what I'd been told would happen, that someone had paid for me and I was being delivered to them." "Do you know what happened to the other women?" the judge asked. "No, we were separated early on. I don't even know their names." Aldrich rose smoothly. "Your Honor, while Mrs. Hale's story is tragic, if true, she's provided no evidence whatsoever linking these alleged crimes to my client. No bills of sale, no witnesses, nothing but her word against a respected member of the business community." "Actually," Calvin said, standing abruptly, "I have plenty of evidence." All attention swung to him. Aldrich's eyes narrowed. Voss's expression remained unchanged, but Rowan saw his fingers tighten on the armrest of his chair. "State your name for the record," Judge Blackwood said. "Calvin Reed. For 2 years I worked as a collector and transporter for Gideon Voss. I moved human cargo across 3 territories, delivered them to buyers, and documented every transaction." He pulled a folded paper from his pocket. "This is a list of locations, dates, and names. 23 separate deliveries I personally handled, and I have detailed records proving each one." The courtroom erupted in whispers. Aldrich was on his feet immediately. "Your Honor, this is clearly a man seeking immunity by fabricating stories about my client. There's no corroboration." "There's plenty of corroboration," Calvin shot back. "I can name buyers, describe specific locations, provide details only someone involved would know. And if you retrieve the records I've hidden, you'll find documentation that matches my testimony exactly." "Convenient that these records are hidden," Aldrich sneered. "How do we know they even exist?" "Because I'm willing to take you to them right now. Mrs. Chen's boarding house, 3rd Street, room 7. There's a metal box under the floorboards. Open it, and you'll find enough evidence to bury Mr. Voss's entire operation." Judge Blackwood leaned forward. "Mr. Reed, you understand that if these records don't exist, or if they fail to support your claims, you'll be charged with perjury and obstruction of justice." "I understand. I'm willing to take that risk." The judge looked at Voss's lawyers. "Mr. Aldrich, do you wish to challenge this claim?" Aldrich conferred quietly with Voss, their heads bent together. Finally, Aldrich straightened. "Your Honor, we maintain that Mr. Reed is a liar and a fraud. But in the interest of putting this matter to rest, we have no objection to examining these alleged records." "Very well." Judge Blackwood gestured to Marshal Davies. "Take Mr. Reed to the location he specified. If these records exist, bring them back immediately. Court is in recess until you return." The courtroom emptied slowly, people lingering to discuss what they just heard. Rowan, Mara, and Calvin were escorted back to their basement quarters while Davies assembled a team to retrieve the records. Voss and his lawyers disappeared into a private conference room, no doubt strategizing their next move. "That was risky," Rowan said to Calvin once they were alone. "If those records aren't there, they're there." Calvin's voice was firm. "I checked on them 2 weeks ago, right before the delivery that brought Miss Vale to you. Mrs. Chen doesn't even know what's in the box. I told her it was personal documents, asked her to keep them safe. She agreed because she understands what Voss takes from people." "How long until the marshal gets back?" Mara asked. "An hour, maybe less. Mrs. Chen's place isn't far." The wait was excruciating. Rowan paced the small room, imagining everything that could go wrong. The records could have been discovered and destroyed. Mrs. Chen might have moved them. Voss's people could intercept the marshal. 100 scenarios, each worse than the last. Finally, footsteps echoed in the corridor. The door opened, and Marshal Davies entered carrying a battered metal box. His expression was grim. "Found them exactly where he said. Mrs. Chen confirmed she's been holding the box for Mr. Reed. He set it on the bed. I took a quick look. If even half of what's in here is accurate, we're dealing with something a lot bigger than we thought. Calvin opened the box with trembling hands. Inside were dozens of papers, ledgers, receipts, correspondence, maps, years of documentation meticulously organized and preserved. This is everything, Calvin said quietly. Every name, every location, every transaction. Proof that Voss has been running this operation for at least 5 years, moving hundreds of people, generating thousands in profit. Davies sorted through the documents, his face growing darker with each page. There are names here, prominent names. Politicians, lawmen, business owners, people who should have been stopping this, not profiting from it. That's why no one's been able to touch Voss, Mara said. He's got too many powerful people protecting their own interests. Not anymore, Davies closed the box. This goes straight to the judge, and I'm betting once he sees it, Voss's lawyers are going to have a very bad day. They were escorted back to the courtroom an hour later. The box sat on the judge's bench, its contents spread out for examination. Judge Blackwood looked like a man who'd aged a decade in 60 minutes. His face was pale, his hands unsteady as he sorted through the evidence. Court is back in session, he said, his voice heavy. I've reviewed the documents provided by Mr. Reed. They are extensive and deeply troubling. Aldrich stood. Your Honor, we haven't had adequate time to examine this evidence or verify its authenticity. You'll have that opportunity during a full trial, but based on preliminary examination, I find sufficient probable cause to warrant further investigation. Judge Blackwood's eyes fixed on Voss. Mr. Voss, you are hereby ordered to remain in Tucson pending investigation into charges of human trafficking, conspiracy, fraud, and corruption of public officials. You will surrender your passport and post a bond of $50,000. For the first time, Voss's composure cracked. Your Honor, this is outrageous. Based on the fabricated testimony of a criminal, based on documented evidence that corroborates that testimony, evidence your own lawyers agreed to examine. The judge's voice was iron. Mr. Voss, you may be accustomed to operating above the law, but not in my courtroom. The charges stand. Aldrich tried again. Your Honor, my client is a flight risk concern. He has deep ties to this community and deep pockets that could buy him passage to Mexico before sundown. The ruling stands. $50,000 bond, surrender of travel documents, daily check-ins with the marshal's office. Judge Blackwood turned to Rowan and Mara. Mr. and Mrs. Hale, you're free to go, but you'll need to remain available for further testimony as the investigation proceeds. We will, Your Honor, Rowan said. Mr. Reed, you're remanded to protective custody pending trial. Given your cooperation, I'm inclined to recommend leniency, but that decision will ultimately rest with the jury. The judge stood. This court is adjourned. Marshal Davies, ensure Mr. Voss complies with the bond requirements. As they filed out of the courtroom, Rowan saw Voss staring at them. The amusement was gone, replaced by cold calculation. This wasn't over. The man had lost a battle, but not the war. Outside, the afternoon sun was blinding after hours in the dim courthouse. Mara stood on the steps, taking deep breaths of free air. We did it, she said wonderingly. We actually did it. But we survived, Rowan corrected. Voss is still out there, still dangerous, but exposed now. His operation is under investigation, his protection is crumbling. That's more than anyone's managed before. She was right. They'd accomplished what Rowan had thought impossible, dragging Voss into daylight, forcing the law to acknowledge crimes it had willfully ignored. It wasn't justice yet, but it was the beginning of justice. What happens now? Mara asked. Now we figure out what comes next. Together, if you want. She looked at him, really looked at him, seeing past the desperate circumstances that had thrown them together. Ask me again. Your question from before. Rowan felt his heart rate pick up. Mara Vale, will you marry me? Not as protection, not as legal strategy, but as a choice. A real choice. Ask me in a month, she said softly, when the dust has settled and we know who we are outside of crisis. Ask me when there's time to build something instead of just survive something. A month, Rowan agreed. They walked down the courthouse steps together into a future that was uncertain but no longer defined solely by fear. Behind them, inside that building, wheels of justice were beginning to turn. Slowly, grinding against corruption and resistance, but turning nonetheless. And somewhere in the city, Gideon Voss was realizing that for the first time in his career, he'd underestimated his opponents. He'd seen Rowan as a broken rancher and Mara as disposable property. He'd never imagined they'd become the instruments of his downfall. That mistake was going to cost him everything. Part 5. Lưu ý. Viết 6.000 đến 6.500 từ liên kết liền mạch với các phần trước trong câu chuyện, phá hồi thoại tạo thành một câu chuyện liền mạch khi ghép lại. Mỗi phần liền mạch với phần trước, không giới thiệu lại câu chuyện ở đầu phần mới. Liên kết các phần của câu chuyện một cách liền mạch, sử dụng câu chuyện tiếp giữa các phần. Duy trì chủ đề, tránh ngắt quãng đột ngột, không sử dụng gạch đầu dòng hoặc tiêu đề phụ, phong cách kể chuyện Mỹ, Hoa Kỳ, giống văn giàu cảm xúc. Kể theo ngôi thứ 3, giữ đồ kịch tính, không viết lan man, văn 5 giải quyết hết vấn đề và kết thúc trọn vẹn câu chuyện. Câu chuyện không nhắc đến Chúa, lưu ý trả lời trong một tin nhắn không nhảy sang document, chi dần bắt buộc, không được xuất hiện trong nội dung truyền. Đây là một câu chuyện điện ảnh hoàn toàn hư cấu được tạo ra chỉ nhằm mục đích giải trí, không đề cập hay ngụ ý rằng nó dựa trên sự kiện có thật, người thật hoặc câu chuyện có thật. Không sử dụng các cụm từ như dựa trên một câu chuyện có thật, theo ghi chép hoặc bất cứ điều gì tương tự. Tất cả các nhân vật, địa điểm, tổ chức và sự kiện phải hoàn toàn hư cấu. Show more 10 giờ 45 phút, Part 9. The boarding house Mara found was on the quieter edge of Tucson, away from the saloons and the noise. Mrs. Chen had recommended it after learning they needed a place to stay while the investigation proceeded. 2 rooms on the second floor, modest but clean, with a window overlooking a dusty street where children played and merchants hawked their wares. It's not much, Mara said, setting down her small bundle of belongings. They'd bought a few necessities with the last of Rowan's money. A change of clothes, basic supplies, enough to get by until they figured out their next move. It's more than enough. Rowan stood at the window, watching the street below. Part of him still expected to see Voss's men emerging from the shadows, guns drawn. The courthouse victory felt fragile, like glass that could shatter with one wrong move. That first night, neither of them slept well. Every sound brought Rowan to full alertness, hand reaching for the gun he kept under his pillow. Mara paced her room until well past midnight, her footsteps creaking on the floorboards. They were free, technically, but freedom didn't erase the past weeks of terror. Morning brought Marshal Davies to their door. He looked tired, like he'd been up all night, but there was satisfaction in his expression. "Thought you'd want to know," he said. "Voss tried to skip town last night, made it about 10 miles before our people caught him. He's in a cell now, bond revoked." Rowan felt something loosen in his chest. He tried to run? Panicked, most likely. The investigation's moving faster than he expected. Territorial Marshal's office is coordinating with authorities in 3 other territories. Warrants are being issued, assets frozen. The whole network is collapsing. Davies pulled out a folded newspaper. "You're famous, by the way." The headline read, "Trafficking Ring Exposed. Rancher and Bride Bring Down Empire of Crime." Below it was a surprisingly accurate account of the court proceedings, including Calvin's testimony and the evidence that had been presented. Papers from Phoenix and Santa Fe picked it up too, Davies continued. "By tomorrow, this will be news across the whole Southwest. Voss can't bury this anymore. Too many people know." "What about the people he sold?" Mara asked quietly. "The victims still out there?" "We're working on it. Calvin's records included buyer information. We've already sent telegrams to law enforcement in a dozen cities. Some of those people might be found, might be freed. Can't promise we'll get everyone, but we're trying." After Davies left, Mara turned to Rowan. "We started something we can't control now." "Is that bad?" "I don't know. It's just bigger than us. Bigger than I expected." She sat on the edge of the bed, suddenly looking exhausted. What if it's not enough? What if Voss finds a way out, buys his freedom, and this all falls apart? Rowan sat beside her. Then at least we tried. At least we didn't let fear win. I'm tired of being brave. Is that terrible? I just want to sleep without nightmares. I want to wake up and not immediately think about survival. That's not terrible. That's human. Rowan took her hand. The trial will take time, months probably, but we don't have to stay in Tucson for all of it. We could go back to the ranch, rebuild, start living again instead of just fighting. Is there still a ranch? Voss said you were behind on taxes. I wasn't. That was manufactured, part of his scheme, but I should check, make sure everything's sorted. Rowan stood. Want to come with me to the land office? They walked through Tucson's morning streets, past merchants opening shops and workers heading to their jobs. Normal life, the kind that had seemed impossible just days ago. At the land office, a clerk confirmed what Rowan had suspected. The tax lien had been falsified, created through bribed officials who were now under investigation themselves. Your property's clear, Mr. Hale, the clerk said. In fact, given the circumstances, the territorial government is waiving your taxes for the next year as compensation for the fraud perpetrated against you. It was a small victory, but it felt significant. The system that had been used against them was now, however imperfectly, trying to make things right. Over the next 2 weeks, they fell into a routine. Mornings at the courthouse, answering questions, providing additional testimony as investigators pieced together the full scope of Voss's operation. Afternoons exploring Tucson, relearning how to exist without constant fear. Evenings in the boarding house, talking about futures that might actually happen. I've been thinking about Kansas City, Mara said one evening. They were sitting on the boarding house porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and gold. I had friends there, people who might be wondering what happened to me. You could write to them. I could, but I don't know if I want to go back. That life feels like it belonged to someone else. She turned to look at him. What about you? What did you want before all this? Honestly, nothing. I was just existing, waiting for time to pass. Rowan leaned back in his chair. But now, I don't know. Maybe I want to matter again, to build something instead of just maintaining what's left. Like what? Haven't figured that out yet. The trial began in late October, when the desert heat had finally broken and the air carried the first hints of cooler weather. The courthouse was packed every day, journalists from across the territories filling the gallery, sketching the proceedings for their papers. Voss sat at the defense table in expensive suits, maintaining his composure even as witness after witness dismantled his claims of innocence. Calvin testified for 3 days straight, walking the jury through the operation's structure, naming names, describing crimes in clinical detail. When Aldrich tried to break him on cross-examination, Calvin held firm. You're asking me to deny what I saw with my own eyes, Calvin said quietly. I can't do that. I won't. Mara testified next, her voice steady as she described her kidnapping, the terror of being transported like cargo, the moment she woke up believing she'd been bought. Several jurors wiped their eyes when she finished. Rowan's testimony was shorter but no less powerful. He described finding Mara, the note pinned to her chest, the collectors who'd come to retrieve her, and he talked about the marriage certificate, not as a legal maneuver, but as a desperate attempt to protect another human being from being treated as property. Why risk so much for a stranger? The prosecutor asked. Because she wasn't property. She was a person, and pretending otherwise makes us all complicit in evil. The defense's strategy was to attack credibility. Aldrich painted Calvin as a liar seeking immunity, Mara as a woman scorned by some unnamed buyer, Rowan as a bitter man looking for revenge against a successful businessman. But the evidence kept undermining their narrative. The records were too detailed, too consistent, the testimony too compelling. On the 8th day of trial, something unexpected happened. One of Voss's former associates, a man named Porter who'd been named in Calvin's records, appeared outside the courthouse and demanded to speak with the prosecutor. He'd been granted immunity in exchange for testimony, and what he had to say changed everything. Porter testified that Voss's operation went far beyond what even Calvin knew. There were connections to criminal enterprises in San Francisco, Chicago, even New York. Politicians on multiple levels had taken bribes. Law enforcement had been systematically corrupted. The scope was staggering. Why come forward now? The prosecutor asked. Because I watched that young woman testify, Porter said, gesturing toward Mara. And I thought about my own daughter, about what I'd want someone to do if she'd been taken. I couldn't keep protecting a monster just to save myself. Aldrich tried to salvage the case, calling character witnesses who praised Voss's philanthropy, his business acumen, his contributions to territorial development. But it rang hollow against the mountain of evidence showing what he'd really been building. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. When they returned, the foreman's voice was clear and firm. On the charge of human trafficking, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of conspiracy, guilty. On the charge of fraud, guilty. On the charge of corruption of public officials, guilty. Voss's face went white. For the first time since Rowan had known him, the man looked genuinely afraid. Judge Blackwood's sentencing was swift and merciless. Mr. Voss, you have caused immeasurable suffering in pursuit of profit. You have corrupted institutions meant to protect the vulnerable and betrayed the public trust. I hereby sentence you to 30 years hard labor in the territorial prison with no possibility of parole. Additionally, all your assets are forfeited to establish a fund for victim compensation and recovery. As marshals led Voss away in chains, he looked back at Rowan one last time. There was no amusement now, no confidence, just the hollow realization that the empire he'd built had crumbled to dust. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed Rowan, Mara, and Calvin, shouting questions. Marshal Davies and his team formed a barrier, keeping them back. How does it feel to have brought down one of the territory's most powerful criminals? What's next for you both? Are you really married, or was that just a legal strategy? Rowan raised a hand, and gradually the crowd quieted. We didn't do this for fame or recognition. We did it because human beings shouldn't be bought and sold like cattle. If our story helps others find the courage to stand up against evil, then that's enough. As for what's next, he looked at Mara. We're going to live. Really live, not just survive. That's all. They pushed through the crowd, making their way back to the boarding house. Calvin was being transferred to a safer facility pending his own trial, which would likely result in a significantly reduced sentence given his cooperation. He shook Rowan's hand before leaving. Thank you, Calvin said, for giving me a chance to do something right. Thank you for taking it. That night, Rowan and Mara sat on the porch again, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. The tension that had been their constant companion for weeks had finally lifted, leaving behind exhaustion and something that felt almost like peace. So, Mara said softly, it's been more than a month. Rowan turned to look at her. It has. You said to ask you again when the dust settled. I remember. The dust has settled. We know who we are outside of crisis now. We've had time to build something instead of just survive. She took his hand. So I'm asking, do you still want to marry me? For real this time? Rowan felt his throat tighten with emotion. More than anything. Then ask me properly. He slid off his chair kneeling on the porch boards and took both her hands in his. Mara Vale, you're the strongest, bravest person I've ever met. You've been through hell and come out the other side still believing in goodness. I don't know what the future holds, but I know I want to face it with you. Will you marry me? Yes. Mara pulled him up and they kissed under the desert stars. A real kiss this time, not born of desperation, but of genuine feeling. Yes, I'll marry you. They were married a week later in a small ceremony at the courthouse, with Judge Blackwood presiding and Marshal Davies as witness. Mrs. Chen attended, bringing flowers from her garden. A few reporters lingered outside, but the ceremony itself was private, intimate, exactly what they both needed. When Judge Blackwood pronounced them husband and wife, Rowan felt something he hadn't experienced in over a decade. Genuine joy. Not the absence of pain, but the presence of something good enough to outweigh it. You've both earned this happiness, Judge Blackwood said quietly after the ceremony. Use it well. They spent their wedding night in the boarding house, talking until dawn about plans and dreams and possibilities. The ranch needed work, but it could be restored. Mara had ideas about expanding, maybe raising horses instead of just cattle. Rowan wanted to repair the barn, plant a garden like Sarah used to keep. We could build something good there, Mara said. Something that honors what you lost while creating something new. I'd like that. And maybe, she hesitated, maybe someday we could help others, people who've been through what I went through, give them a safe place to heal. Rowan thought about that, about turning the ranch into something more than just a home, but a refuge, a place where people who'd been broken by cruelty could find kindness. That's a big undertaking. We've handled bigger. Fair point. He smiled. Let's start small. Get the ranch running again, build our life, then we'll see about saving the world. They left Tucson 3 days later, their wagon loaded with supplies purchased from the compensation fund Judge Blackwood had helped them access. The journey back to the ranch took 2 days, and with each mile, Rowan felt the weight of the past weeks lifting. The ranch looked exactly as he'd left it, worn but standing, waiting for someone to breathe life back into it. Mara stood in the yard, surveying the property with the eye of someone already planning improvements. It needs work, she said. Everything worthwhile does. They spent the first week cleaning, repairing the most urgent damage, establishing routines. Rowan taught Mara how to mend fence line and shoe horses. She taught him how to cook meals more complicated than beans and jerky. They worked side by side, building calluses and building a life. News continued to filter in from Tucson. The investigation had expanded to other territories, resulting in dozens of arrests. Several prominent politicians had resigned in disgrace. Law enforcement agencies were being overhauled, cleaned of corruption. The change was slow and incomplete, but it was real. And occasionally, letters arrived from people they'd never met. Victims who'd been found and freed, writing to thank them. Families reunited after years of separation. Each letter was a reminder that their ordeal had mattered, that the pain had produced something valuable. One letter came from a young woman in California who'd been rescued from a brothel after Porter's testimony revealed its connection to Voss's network. She'd been one of the women held with Mara during the early days of captivity. I never thought I'd see freedom again, the letter read. But because you were brave enough to fight, I'm alive and safe. Thank you doesn't seem like enough, but it's all I have. Thank you. Mara cried when she read it, tears of relief and grief and cautious hope. We can't save everyone, she said. No, Rowan agreed, but we saved some. That counts. Winter came early that year, bringing cold winds that rattled the windows and snow that dusted the desert like sugar. They spent evenings by the fire, reading, talking, simply existing together without crisis or urgency. Rowan told Mara about Sarah and Emma, not the sanitized memories he'd been carrying, but the real complicated truth of who they'd been. Mara shared stories of her mother, of her life before Kansas City, of dreams she'd abandoned and was now daring to resurrect. I used to want my own dress shop, she said one evening. Seems silly now. Why silly? Because after everything that's happened, something that small seems insufficient. Small dreams aren't insufficient. They're the foundation everything else is built on. Rowan poked at the fire, sending sparks spiraling up the chimney. You don't have to save the world every day. Sometimes it's enough to make one beautiful dress for one person who needs it. You really think that? I do. Spring arrived with unexpected gentleness, bringing green to the desert and new possibilities. They planted the garden Rowan had imagined, working the soil together under the warming sun. Mara ordered fabric and patterns from a supplier in Tucson, setting up a small workspace in what had been Emma's room. Does it bother you? She asked. Me using this space? No. Rowan leaned against the doorframe, watching her arrange supplies. I think it's good. This room should have life in it again. The first dress she made was for Mrs. Chen's granddaughter, a simple blue cotton piece that the girl wore with such pride that Mrs. Chen cried. Word spread, and soon Mara had more orders than she could fill. She hired a woman from Tombstone to help with the sewing, paying fair wages and creating work where there'd been none. Rowan expanded the horse operation, breeding and training animals that quickly gained a reputation for quality. He hired 2 hands to help with the work, young men who needed jobs and proved reliable. The ranch wasn't wealthy, but it was prosperous enough. More importantly, it was alive. 1 year after the trial, Marshal Davies visited with news. The territorial legislature had passed new laws criminalizing human trafficking with mandatory minimum sentences. Additional protections had been established for vulnerable populations. A special prosecutor's office had been created to investigate corruption. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. "You two started something important," Davies said. "Changed the way people think about these crimes, made it impossible to ignore them anymore." "We just told the truth," Mara said. "Sometimes that's revolutionary." That summer, Rowan and Mara rode to Tombstone to visit Clarence Whitmore. The old justice of the peace was delighted to see them, insisting they join him for dinner. Over beef stew and cornbread, they caught up on the past year's changes. "Voss's assets funded recovery programs in 6 territories," Clarence said. "They're helping people rebuild their lives, providing legal assistance, medical care, counseling. Hundreds of people getting support because you two refused to back down." "What about the other people in his network?" Rowan asked. "The buyers, the enablers? Some went to prison, some fled to Mexico, some died mysterious deaths, probably other criminals tying up loose ends." Clarence shook his head. "But the network's broken. It'll take years before anything like it could operate again, and now there are people watching, ready to sound the alarm." Walking back to their wagon after dinner, Mara slipped her hand into Rowan's. "Do you ever regret it? Taking me in, getting involved in all of this?" "Not once. Not even when we were running for our lives in the desert?" "Okay, maybe for a second then," Rowan smiled. "But no. Meeting you, fighting beside you, building a life with you, that's the best thing that ever happened to me. I was dead before you arrived, just hadn't stopped breathing yet. You gave me a reason to live again." "You saved my life, Rowan. And you saved mine." They returned to the ranch under a sky full of stars, to a home that felt permanent and real. The past year had taught them both that healing wasn't linear, that nightmares still came sometimes, that scars didn't disappear just because you survived. But it had also taught them that joy could coexist with sorrow, that new chapters could be written without erasing the old ones, that broken things could be remade into something different but equally valuable. That night, as they lay in bed listening to the desert wind, Mara spoke into the darkness. "I'm pregnant." Rowan's heart stopped, then restarted at double speed. "You're sure?" 3 months. I didn't want to say anything until I was certain." "How do you feel about it?" "Terrified, excited, hopeful." She rolled over to face him. "I know it's complicated, given everything, but I want this child. I want a future that includes more than just survival." Rowan pulled her close, feeling tears on his cheeks that he didn't bother to hide. "Sarah would have loved you. Emma would have adored you. Tell me about them, everything. I want our child to know about the family that came before." So he did. He talked until his voice grew hoarse, sharing memories he'd locked away for too long. The good and the bad, the beautiful and the painful, all of it woven together into the complicated truth of love and loss. And Mara listened, absorbing it all, making space for his past in their shared future. The baby arrived in late winter, a girl with Mara's gray eyes and Rowan's determined chin. They named her Sarah Emma Hale, honoring what had been lost while celebrating what had been found. Mrs. Chen traveled from Tucson to help during the first weeks, bringing wisdom and warmth and endless patience. "She's beautiful," Mrs. Chen said, holding the baby with practiced ease. "She carries hope with her. You can see it." Rowan stood at the window, watching dawn break over the desert, his daughter sleeping peacefully in the next room, his wife resting after the long labor. He thought about the wagon that had arrived on his property 18 months ago, carrying a woman who would change everything, about the choice to help instead of turn away, to fight instead of surrender. The frontier hadn't grown kinder. Evil still existed in shadows and sunlight both. But 2 people had refused to accept cruelty as inevitable, had insisted that human beings deserved dignity and protection. That refusal had rippled outward, touching lives they'd never meet, changing systems they'd never see. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. There was still work to do, battles to fight, people who needed help. But it was an ending that felt earned, built on hard choices and harder consequences, on trauma transformed into purpose. Mara appeared beside him, tired but radiant. "What are you thinking?" that we survived, that we built something good out of something terrible, that our daughter will grow up knowing her parents refused to let fear win. Think she'll appreciate that when she's older? I hope so. Rowan wrapped an arm around Mara's shoulders. But even if she doesn't, we'll know. We'll remember that we stood up when it mattered. They stood together watching the sun rise over land that had seen so much suffering, but also so much resilience. The desert stretched endlessly in all directions, harsh and beautiful, unchanged by human drama, yet somehow made more meaningful by it. Behind them, Sarah Emma stirred in her crib, making the small sounds of a baby waking to a world that was still dangerous, but also full of people willing to fight for what was right. She didn't know it yet, but she'd been born into a story of courage and redemption, of ordinary people doing extraordinary things because someone had to. The ground beneath them hadn't grown softer. The world hadn't become fair, or just simply because they'd won one battle. But they'd changed what was possible, proven that even in the hardest places, even against the most powerful opposition, truth and determination could create cracks in seemingly impenetrable walls. And sometimes, Rowan thought as he went to pick up his daughter, sometimes a crack was enough. Enough to let light in, enough to give others hope, enough to prove that the fight was worth it. The frontier would remain the frontier, wild, dangerous, testing everyone who dared to make a life in its harsh embrace. But within it, in a modest ranch house miles from anywhere important, a family had taken root. Not replacing what had been lost, but honoring it by choosing to believe in futures worth building. Mara joined him beside the crib, and together they looked down at their daughter, at this new life that represented everything they'd fought for. Freedom, choice, the right to exist without fear of being treated as less than human. "She'll have a better world than we did," Mara said softly. "Maybe. If we keep fighting for it, then we fight. Together. Always." The baby opened her eyes, gray as storm clouds, and looked up at her parents with the solemn wisdom all infants seem to carry. She didn't cry or fuss, just studied these faces that would define her world. These people who'd refused to let darkness have the final word. Outside, the desert wind carried the promise of spring. Inside, 3 lives intertwined by choice and circumstance settled into the quiet rhythm of an ordinary morning, made extraordinary only by the fact that they'd survived to see it. And somewhere in a territorial prison, Gideon Voss stared at stone walls and understood, finally, that the power he'd wielded had been an illusion. True strength belonged to people who chose compassion over cruelty, who saw human beings instead of property, who stood up when standing up cost them everything. He'd been defeated not by force or wealth, but by something simpler and far more powerful, 2 people who decided that some things were worth the risk. The story that had begun with a wagon delivery on a dusty ranch had rippled outward, touching lives across territories, changing laws, freeing the enslaved, punishing the guilty. It wasn't a perfect ending. Those didn't exist in the real world. But it was an ending that mattered, built on choices made in moments of crisis by people who refused to look away. And in the years to come, when Sarah Emma Hale asked about the scars on her mother's wrists and the sadness that sometimes shadowed her father's eyes, they would tell her the truth about evil that had seemed unstoppable, about courage found in desperation, about love born from shared trauma and transformed into something enduring. They would tell her that the world could be brutal and unfair, but that individual choices still mattered, that standing up against cruelty, even when the odds seemed impossible, was always worth doing, that sometimes the greatest victories came from simply refusing to surrender, from insisting that human dignity was non-negotiable. And they would tell her that she'd been born from that refusal, that she carried in her veins the blood of people who'd chosen hope over despair, action over paralysis, life over mere survival. The sun climbed higher, burning away the last of the morning chill. In the ranch house, a family went about the business of living, feeding the baby, making breakfast, planning the day's work. Simple things, ordinary things, made precious by how easily they could have been lost. Rowan looked at his wife, at his daughter, at the home they'd built from wreckage and will. The past would always be part of them, scars that never fully healed. But the future was theirs to shape, and they were shaping it with intention and love and the hard-won knowledge that freedom was never given, only fought for and defended. The frontier stretched endlessly around them, indifferent and eternal. But they'd carved out a corner of it and made it their own, turned wilderness into sanctuary, transformed survivors into a family. It was enough. It was everything.